Good morning, everyone. We're still waiting for one panelist, but I think we'll go ahead and get started now. So my name is Morris Allen. I'm the editor of Metaphorosis and your host for today's event. I should warn you that I'm on the West Coast in Oregon, and we have high winds, so it's possible that my internet will go out, and if so, then go on without me. But let me give everybody a chance to introduce themselves. Kanika?
Hi, I'm Kanika Agrawal. I'm just going to be a voice today. I am fiction editor for khōréō magazine, and I also work as an editor for two other literary magazines that are open to publishing speculative work. And those are Foglifter, which is specifically for queer and trans writers, and Conjunctions, which is open to any demographic.
Okay, thank you, Kanika. Fran?
Hi, I'm Fran Eisemann. I edit the Cosmic Roots and Eldritch Shores. We publish science fiction, fantasy, myth, fairy tales, and Eldritch spooky stories, and articles and reviews.
Okay. We've got a relatively low number of participants here so far this morning. So if you want to introduce yourselves, you're welcome to. If you feel, if you prefer to just linger in the background, that's fine too.
Hi, I'm Alicia Adams. I'm a speculative writer and I work in tech. I live in Southern California.
Okay, great. Anybody else? Bryce?
Hello, my name is Bryce. I'm here in Edmonton. I've done some speculative writing in the past, but I'm kind of just getting started with it just in this past year.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, maybe I should add that my internet I may freeze occasionally because my internet connection is satellite and it's not 100%. So
It's not just that you're practicing to participate in the next Squid Game, the red light, green light thing.
Sorry. Yeah.
Let's go ahead then. Any questions from the audience? Go ahead, Bryce.
I had a question. So I've looked at, I think most of the videos that you guys have posted in the past, and there have been some commentary about the profitability of the magazines. I think early on somebody asked, well, did you make any money? And most people just kind of chuckled and said no. So in the time that I've kind of been looking at the short story market, I've seen a couple your publications close. And I'm wondering, do they kind of just froth up and froth down? Do you see it as something that's growing or stable, or is it maybe shrinking a little bit as we go on here? And I'm also curious, for the people who do podcasts, how much kind of the consumption is on that end?
Sure thing. I think you'll find there's not much profit in this whole business, but Fran, do you want to take that first?
Well, yeah, as far as magazines appearing and disappearing, that's true. There are a lot of people who like the idea of publishing a magazine and how cool it would be to have these great stories and podcasts and articles and reviews and everything up there. But once you get into the production of it, there's so much involved that's not business, and not technical, but just
He usually comes back in a few seconds.
things all the time, and so they end up closing. so things do disappear. That maybe we're good, but people say, well, no, I just want to go back to writing my own stuff. And I think that's a temptation a lot of times. It's like, well, doing all these different things that need to be done to maintain a magazine and put out stories. Well, maybe I should just be writing my own stuff. So yeah, people appear and disappear, and that's not anything bad. It's just they realize, where they want to put their time, and maybe they, people do sometimes think, oh well, we can maintain ourselves. We'll get enough subscribers or whatever, and it's just the internet keeps growing, and so getting attention from enough people is always difficult. And that's a whole other part is creating, doing publicity, which almost every publisher doesn't want to do at all, because that's not where they're into the creative. They're not into advertising. So yeah, that's.
Kanika?
Yeah, I think, as someone who edits for a speculative magazine that is run entirely by volunteers, you're always sort of trying to figure out what is fair to ask of people, sort of what the needs of the magazines are versus what we can really ask from individuals who are offering their time. And of course, the problem of wanting, in our case, we are a magazine for immigrant and diaspora writers. We have an interest in featuring writers and having people on staff who have been historically marginalized. At the same time, it seems problematic to ask those very people to give us their time without any payment. We do pay our writers professional rates, but have not yet gotten to the point where we're able to pay staff anything at all. And something that our founder has mentioned in discussions about finding the money to be able to offer some kind of honoraria to staff is that, particularly within the speculative community, perhaps more so even than in the literary community, there's almost a kind of expectation that this is often work that people do on a volunteer basis, or from the goodness of their hearts or whatever. And so even, for example, when we've done some of our fundraising through Kickstarters. So when when rewards are offered for reaching higher tiers of funding that are like, oh, if we reach this tier, we'll pay our writers more per word, there's an interest in that. But when reaching a higher tier means this will allow us to offer honoraria to our staff, that doesn't seem to be as attractive to donors. So I think that there are multiple problems within the community in terms of the even just the level of interest there is in this being anything more than volunteer work for a lot of people. And so that does tend to mean that magazines sort of fade in and out. Or even if the magazine continues, that there's often a lot of internal turnover in staff because people burn out, people realize that they actually are not able to take on all of those responsibilities of running a magazine. Or as Fran mentioned, they realize that, oh, if I keep doing this, I'm not actually, since a lot of since a lot of magazine staff members are writers themselves, they realize that if I give all my time to this, I'm not going to be able to do my own writing. And so there's often a lot of turnover for that reason as well.
Yeah, I would echo that last point that Kanika just made. It's certainly true for me, since we're just about to start our 9th year at Metaphorosis, and I essentially haven't done any writing in all that time. There's not enough time to do all the things that you need to do and run the magazine. I think that there are certainly more magazines now than there used to be, and I think that the advent of the internet and electronic tools has really democratized the process. So it's much, much easier to start and run a magazine now than it used to be. I certainly would never have started a magazine in the old days, to dealing with paper suppliers and printers and distributors and so on. It was much more difficult, and now it's very easy. That said, it's also very expensive. We spend a net of about $5,000 a year more than we take in. We've got some reasonably generous supporters on Patreon. That covers a certain percentage of our costs, but it is a percentage, and it's not a big percentage, frankly. And some of that money is from some larger donors who've been very supportive over the years. We don't have that many in terms of absolute number. I do think that magazines spring up and fall away, and that's a normal thing. It's a little bit like the restaurant business. Most restaurants fail, most magazines fail. They don't run long term. So you have to, and I myself as a writer, I think I've been in 3 or 4 magazines where my story was in the last issue and then they fail. You kind of take on this, well, I killed that one, now I'm going to kill that one. That's not really what happens, obviously, but it's, I think that's a normal process. I do think that there's quite a lot of burnout. It's just wearing. I read stories, it's certainly not a one-man shop here, but I read all the stories first. And so I read between 5 and 50 stories a day, and it just gets wearing after a while because you want to approach each story as, God, I'm really excited to see what this story is going to be like. But sometimes when it's story number 49 and you've had a long day at work, it's hard to generate that enthusiasm, and that's not fair to the writer. So you have to worry about that. And the other thing that Fran touched on in the beginning is that, for me at least, I find the promotion side of it incredibly wearing, whether it's submitting to the best of the year anthologies or to awards, or just using social media or whatever. Sometimes it's a bit fun, but that's not really my kind of thing. And yet it's my job as the publisher and the editor of this magazine, and it takes a lot out of you. Maybe extroverts or people who really love social media would have a great time with it, but I don't. It's difficult. So that takes time. The other side, the plus side, there are a lot of plus sides as well. I mean, editing a magazine is a lot of fun. I love working with the authors. I love working on the stories. We're a very hands-on magazine. That part is a lot of fun. I think we've published some really good stuff. So there's a lot of plus side to it as well. The other side of your question, I think nobody else has touched on yet, is the podcasts. And for me, that's a little bit odd, frankly. I'm not a podcast listener. I can't focus on things unless there's a visual element to go with it, preferably text. And so listening to just audio, I find my mind tends to wander. So I don't listen to podcasts very much. On the other hand, we've got a great podcast editor, Matt Gomez, who does a terrific job with these things. People love it, and the podcast numbers are, by my view, through the roof. I mean, lots and lots of people download the podcast and listen to that, which is great. It's harder for me to evaluate because that's not my thing, but the numbers look really good and people make all sorts of great comments. So that's a positive, and I'm glad that we're able to provide that. And that's really down to Matt now, who's continuing it, and a couple of others before him who started our podcast process. But it seems like the podcast side of it is a pretty big success. People also obviously read the stories, whether in print form or online or in ebooks, what have you. But I think the podcast thing has been a big plus. And that's one of the things that I wouldn't have been able to do without somebody else. I never even considered it. A couple of people had approached me at cons and said, hey, I could help you with podcasts. And I put it off for quite a long time because I don't know anything about podcasts. I don't know how to do it. I don't know how it works. And some folks came on and helped me get it set up, and Matt has done a great job of continuing that. So I think that's an important part of the process because people do consume a lot of podcasts these days. And that's the kind of thing that I think it's useful for magazine editors to keep in mind. I'm not a podcast listener, but a lot of other people are. So you have to keep your mind open to the other ways of consuming the magazine other than just, I'm a reader, I want to read things, I want to have great stories out there. There's other ways to get at it that, and I'm sure there are others as well that, we could be doing, I don't know, graphic novels or something that, again, is way outside my skill set, but that it's worth considering. I don't know, Fran or Kanika, you guys, I can't recall whether you guys do podcasts or have comments on that.
We've done a few, and actually, I never liked the idea of just the voice. Although if people want to listen to it while they're doing something else, that actually works very well. But I did it so that there was some kind of visual to go with it, like a fireplace with logs in it while the person is speaking, and then that ended up making it very difficult for me because coming up with nice visuals to go with the narration because I couldn't keep up with the images. So I'm thinking of getting back to that actually. Because, yeah, it is a nice way to do things. It is an extra way that could be added on for people to choose besides reading the story, which always illustrate the story. So.
There you go. Okay. Kanika, do you guys do a podcast?
Yeah, so we do audio productions of all of our stories. Not exactly a podcast, or maybe not meeting everyone's definition of a podcast, but we do audio productions of all of our stories. I don't have the numbers on that in terms of how popular those are compared to people reading the digital magazine. We have received critical attention for our audio work and won an Ignite Award for it. And we are committed to continuing to do those productions. But yeah, I'm afraid I don't have any sense really of how much of an audience is coming to us through those audio versions of our stories versus through reading them in the digital magazine or just on our website.
I was trying to remember our podcast numbers offhand without pulling them up, and I don't recall the kind of the per story numbers, but I do know that we've been doing these for 6 years or so, I think, and I think we just passed the 100,000 download mark, maybe 120,000
wow.
download. So it's a lot, certainly by my perspective. So I think that's a great addition.
Yeah, I think there's one problem with if it's hosted through YouTube, where now like commercials end up getting added to almost everything, and so I want to figure out a way to have those up without the YouTube commercials. So other ways of of hosting.
You know, what we've done on that front, we use a site or an app called Podbean, which
Oh,
costs about $100 a year, I think, something like that. So it's not it's a big cost for small market magazines like us, but it's not a huge cost in an absolute sense. They also automatically repost it on YouTube, so it's on YouTube as well. But I think most people get it through Podbean or Spotify or Apple Podcasts. I've forgotten what the name of the thing is, but they do the distribution automatically, so it's much easier. You can also add ads to your podcast there if you want. We don't do ads of any kind, so we've avoided that option, but they give you a variety of options for adding ads in if that's where you make your money.
oh, okay.
Most of us
Oh.
don't make any money, so.
Thank you.
Ismail has a question. Ismail, do you want to ask that directly, or shall I read for you? I'll read it.
I can ask it. I can ask it directly. So I just wanted to know, like, in your opinion, what are the key differences between literary and speculative fiction, and what are some of the mistakes you see writers who are, initially literary writers? What are some of the mistakes you see them making when transitioning to the speculative market?
Now, I'm going to pass that off to other people because I frankly don't see an important difference. There are categories for booksellers, but otherwise I don't really see a distinct bright line difference. I think the only mistake that I could point to, and this is not particular to literary writers, is if you're going to write speculative stories, you need to understand the history of speculative tropes. You need to know what's familiar, what's not familiar, what people are aware of, what they're not, how faster than light drives work in a nominal sense in these kinds of stories, what kind of the rules are for magic, what have you. You can do different things, but you need to understand what it is. It's not something where you say, hey, I'm just going to write a speculative story today. It's probably better if you're a fan first. But your key question about the differences, I'm probably not the guy to approach. So Fran, do you want to start with that?
Well, I don't know what the official definition might be, but for me, I feel that a literary story might mean one that has beautiful writing. That's what I see often. You see beautiful writing, a beautifully pictured vignette, or very well written, but no real story. There's no progression, there's no arc, there's no development, there's no resolution necessarily. It's focused on the experience of the moment of the as you're reading this beautiful writing. Whereas and it could be any subject at all. Whereas speculative usually means something, a science fiction, fantasy, some kind of mythical subject. So literary usually applies more to real life possibilities, where speculative goes into things that are on the magical or not real side. But the speculative also tends to have a complete story with development and beginning, middle, and character development and resolution. That's how I would see it. And I guess if someone is transitioning from literary to speculative, they want to keep in mind that that's important. Great writing is always appreciated, but for speculative, you want to see a complete story with some kind of satisfying resolution at the end.
Kanika?
So I would say that for me personally, as a writer and an editor, and also from the perspective of the publications that I edit at, it's not so much that there is that there are clear identifying characteristics that distinguish the two. There is a lot of literary fiction with speculative elements, not just not just contemporary fiction, but there has been in certain traditions of and certain cultures of literature traditions that of what we might today call speculative writing or speculative elements going back hundreds and thousands of years. But I think for me, in terms of what I see coming through, what I see in the queue, and how I read those as an editor and think about them, is that work that is where the writers think of themselves as literary writers or belonging to literary traditions or conventions. There is often much more awareness of and interest in language, on whether we're talking about sonic elements, whether we're talking about experimentation with form, syntax, etc. Formal elements of writing are often in the foreground for literary work. And that's also partly my experience because I myself am a hybrid and experimental writer. So it's also that I work at publications that are particularly interested in seeing more experimental work, both in the speculative and the literary realms. At khōréō, we are not necessarily interested in plot-driven fiction. We do publish stories that have plot. We also publish stories that in which plot is not the most compelling aspect of the story, or in which there isn't, for example, what Fran was identifying as a clear beginning, middle, and end, or some kind of clear trajectory for the characters. So I would say for us, even in speculative fiction, that's not a distinguishing factor. But going back to that sort of how much attention is being paid to language on the level of word and sentence, how much attention is being paid to thinking about form, right? So how is the story told? What are the different ways in which a story can be told formally? I tend to see a lot less variety and experimentation with that in speculative fiction. On the other hand, in terms of conceptual possibilities, in terms of ideation, I often see a lot more interesting things happening in speculative fiction than I do in mainstream literary fiction, where, in fact, in mainstream literary fiction, I often think there's a bit of a dearth of compelling thinking, especially about the possibilities for cultures, communities, peoples who have been historically marginalized. So speculative fiction seems to me a really an arena or a space in which there's some really interesting thinking happening there. But sometimes there's a discrepancy between that, from my perspective, and I will acknowledge that I come from, my training has been in literary fiction or literary writing. But for me, sometimes I see a discrepancy between the quality of the thinking or the imagining and the quality of the craft on a sentence level.
Kanika, let me follow up on that. Some of the things that you said tie in with a question that somebody had submitted as part of the sign-up process for this, which was, I don't have it in front of me now, but which was roughly how much is the quality of the writing important? And I'll get to you next, Alicia. And then how much do you look at other things when evaluating whether to take on or work with a story? So Kanika, do you want to take that on first?
So, I mean, I guess it's all quality of the writing, you know. I mean, ideas are also quality of the writing. But in terms of, especially because in our case, we want as much as possible to work with writers from around the world. You know, and so there may also be, we may be working with writers who are not completely fluent in English, or who don't have, you know, who maybe there are some issues with usage, even though overall the language is working. So when I talk about sort of craft on the sentence level, I'm not really talking about, you know, like things like grammatical correctness or, you know, can you string together a sentence that makes sense? But that there's something compelling about the language. And in fact, we often find that writers for whom English is not a first language often have more interesting use of language than writers, you know, for whom it is, and for whom the way they write the work in English seems almost quote unquote natural. So they're not thinking about it as consciously. So yeah, so I think it's really hard to say. It's really hard to kind of draw any lines, you know, in terms of, oh, well, you know, we care about the quote unquote quality of the writing this much, and then the plot this much, and then the characterization this much. There is a kind of, you know, magic that happens between all of the things that you are thinking about as a writer when constructing something, that makes it difficult to separate anything, like any element from the other elements. That said, I will say that at khōréō, we are particularly interested in seeing work that's pushing the boundaries in terms of experimenting with the possibilities of language and form, and also just of excuse me, and also work that's coming to us from traditions and communities that haven't received as much attention. So I would say both of those are pretty important to us. That can happen with a story that's very plot driven. We've published stories like that. That can happen with a story that's that's maybe much more sort of like Borgesian in nature, where there's where the focus is not really what happens, or not even necessarily to whom it happens, but how what happens is related in language. I don't know if that really answers. I don't know how helpful that is.
Yeah,
but
okay, no, I think that's good. Fran, do you want to take a shot?
Okay, I missed part of your question.
Basically, how do you weigh the style or quality of writing against the other elements of the story and deciding what to follow up with?
Oh, well, if the story's really good, then as an editor, I can work with the writer to bring up the craft part of it, of the structure of it, of the writing itself, so that it's acceptable for reading. If it's not too, if the writing itself isn't too, has too many difficulties. Sometimes there are great ideas or great characters, but the writing is just too undeveloped to help. It would require too much of an edit to deal with it, because you don't want to completely rewrite someone's story. That, and sometimes just asking for revisions can take care of enough. And readers also can appreciate the stories. They don't all have to be at the same high level for everything. Sometimes basic writing, but there's amazing ideas in there, or compelling characters, or wonderful endings, that it balances out. So you have to have some of everything. But yeah, the writing can be developed, and we do that sometimes with people.
From our side, I guess I'd say that the quality of the writing is the first thing that I look at and the first thing that catches my attention. If you're a really excellent writer, I'm going to give you more leeway on the other aspects. There still has to be a plot. There still have to be good characters. It still has to be credible. It has to be engaging. There has to be a resolution at the end. So it's not ignoring the other things. But one of the things that made me want to start this magazine, one of the things that we focused on is quality of writing. And there's a lot of ways to interpret that, and certainly not all of the stories that we publish are the same or have the same style. And I think that's one of the things that a magazine can do. You can have, it's not all Patricia McKillop and long kind of dreamy sentences. There's also the Isaac Asimov stories and the Jack Vance stories, making up words or whatever. So I think that's something that there's room to play with. But certainly writing quality is one of the key things for us. And there are stories where I start reading, I'm like, wow, this is great. God, I hope it ends up well, because the writing is just spot on. As long as there's a good resolution at the end, I'm going to buy this story. That said, as I mentioned, we're a very hands-on market. So no matter how terrific I think your writing is, you're going to go through a bit of an editorial ringer, and we go through anywhere from 2 to 10 revisions of a story, depending on how much patience I and the author have and how well it's going. And that's true for the people whose writing is fantastic from the start, because there's always something that can be improved about the story. And I'm okay with, certainly I wouldn't say rewriting an author's story, but asking them to rewrite the story to make it better. That's just one of the things, and we try to be pretty upfront about that. If you submit a story to us, or if we say we're interested in it, there's going to be this process. We're not a magazine where you submit the story, we buy it, and that's the end of it. There's going to be work involved, even if the writing is fantastic. And sometimes it is. We've got a story, particularly that's coming at the end of December, that I think is one of the best stories we've ever published. The writing is just fantastic, and it's a good speculative story. So anyway.
Oh, yeah, no,
yeah.
that's, yeah, sometimes there's a lot of revision to do.
Yeah.
And sometimes the editor does a good bit of it. Occasionally when you do ask for rewrites, they end up making it more problems than there were in the original. Occasionally that happens.
Yeah.
Have you noticed that?
Sometimes it doesn't work out, and I developed a rule after the first couple of years. I made some painful mistakes, painful for everybody. But at this point, by the second revision, so this is the third version of the story, I try to make a decision about whether I think it's going to work or not. And it has to be the second revision, because sometimes, not often, usually people are pretty responsive. I say, these are the things I want you to try and address in very broad terms. People take a shot at it, and I look at how much work they've done. And there are people who are like, oh, I moved 3 commas, now it's perfect. And I say, no, that's not going to do it. You get another shot, try again. And usually people wake up and they're like, oh, okay, I'll better do some real work on this. If they don't, then I say, hey, this is not going to work out. I'm not going to buy your story. Good luck. It's a good story. Send it somewhere else. But I try to make that decision by the second revision, because otherwise you get to a point where they've been working, they're on the 5th revision, they've been working really hard, I've been working really hard, and I still turn it down, and it's painful for everybody. So if it doesn't look like it's going to work, I try to make that decision reasonably early on.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good policy.
Alicia, you had a question. I appreciate your patience.
Thank you. First, I just want to say thank you so much for doing this. I've watched all of the Ask the Editors for this year, and I've been really enjoying them. So thank you, Morris, for hosting it, and to Fran and Kanika for showing up multiple times to help support us here. I have a lot of questions, and I know we're not going to get to them all, so I have prioritized them. So first question, and then I'll let other people ask questions too. I'm not going to hog it. But in terms of repeat submitters, do you have any data or even observations on how many times you accept an author who has submitted for the 5th or 6th or 7th time? And is that something that you encourage? And is that if someone is following the guidelines, following what you say about repeating after getting a rejection, at what line do you find between someone's being tenacious or someone is being obnoxious? I guess.
I want to take that first, because if I can find them, I've literally just been working up some statistics for the 9 years that we've been around. If I can find my actual numbers here, but there's one thing I would say: we look at everything blind. So I don't know who's the writer behind the story. There were 1 or 2 writers over the time where I just learned to recognize their style, and I thought that's probably so and so, but usually that's not true. And so I make the decision without knowing whether they're a repeat author or a repeat submitter or a first-time submitter. But then I look at the names after I've made a decision, just to kind of keep track of who's submitting and are there familiar names. And I can't find the numbers right now, but I've got people who have submitted 100 times and never sold us a story. And that's not being a pest, that's keep trying. And I think that's great. That's people who are tenacious. And there are people who I've noticed, like, oh, this is a better story. They've gotten better over time. There's some people who don't change, and they've maybe found their niche that they're comfortable with. and that's probably never going to work for us. But I'm not going to say don't ever submit to us again, because they might submit something that's terrific. And there have been people who've submitted multiple times, and then I bought one of their stories. Sometimes that's a sign of a change, and then I buy more of their stories because they've found what it is I'm looking for. And sometimes it was a bit of a fluke and I like that story, but I still don't like their other stories. So I certainly, I encourage all those people to keep submitting to us. I mean, if they've decided, hey, I'm never going to sell to this guy, it's a waste of my time, that's fair too. It doesn't bother me. But it certainly is not a problem for me if they keep submitting. And there are people who submit multiple times. Sometimes there are people who, as I said, they've kind of found their niche and that's what they want to stick with. There's at least a couple that I've offered a rewrite to, and they've said, no, I don't want to do that. Like, this is the story, take it or leave it. And in most cases, then I'm going to leave it. But I'm happy to have people submitting over and over again. And I wish I could find the numbers. It's something like, we've had, I don't know, 20,000 stories or something over the time. And there were a bunch of people who have submitted over 50 times, something like 8 people. There were hundreds who have submitted over 20 times. There were 5, 6, maybe 8,000 people who submitted once. And I guess they're like, well, I didn't sell it to him, that's the end of him. Or maybe they only had the one story. I don't know. I mean, I don't go into all this stuff, but I think it's great for people to keep trying. And ideally, I see change because I'm looking for something in particular. But I find submitting to be one of the most tedious and mind-numbing parts of the whole writing process. The writing is great, the publishing is great, submitting the things, reading everybody's guidelines, and everybody's got a different format, and it's hard to tell, do you want Times Roman or do you want whatever? Do you want me to italicize or not? What formats will you accept? I find that terrible. So the people who've got that down and keep going over and over, kudos to them. Fran?
Yeah, we don't have blind submissions. We know who the authors are. And no, there's absolutely no problem with people submitting a story every submissions round. That's fine. And there are people who have submitted dozens of stories, and we may not accept any of them, but no, absolutely not. The only thing that might be not obnoxious, but give pause is when we have a place for the authors to leave comments to go with their stories, and we ask for very specific things, name, genre, word count, and any personal experience related to the story. You're a mad rocket scientist and the story is about a mad rocket scientist. But guidelines, yeah, we'd like people to follow the guidelines in submitting, in what their comments are and what their stories contain. So that would be the only thing, is like we say, we don't want horror, but people have submitted horror stories. We don't want, gritty, mind-numbing, post-apocalyptic, despairing stories, but we get them. So those are the things that are a little objectionable. It's totally ignoring our guidelines and what we ask for. But as far as submitting multiple times throughout the years, that's no problem. That's fine. Submit as many stories as you like.
Kanika?
Yeah, I'll echo that happy to see writers submitting over and over again, and often if we are seeing work by the same writers, and if those stories are sometimes we'll have writers who keep sending us good work, but the stories are just, for one reason or another, not quite getting there. So we've seen a lot of good work from them, but nothing yet that quite makes it into the magazine. If we see that happening, we'll have a conversation about, we're seeing a lot of good work from this writer. It's not quite getting there. What can we do to support them? Is there a particular story that's at a point where we think we can work with it? Because in our process, we have the stories that we accept and say, like, we're going to accept the story. We do have some feedback for you. We do have some suggestions for you. But ultimately, we're interested in your vision, and we're going to publish this story regardless. We also will have other stories that we think we're not ready to accept, but we're interested enough in that we'd like to give writers the opportunity to revise after we give them feedback, and then reconsider their story in a future submission cycle. So we have both of those ways of working with writers. And as I mentioned, we continue to discuss sort of like how we can support or offer opportunities to writers whose individual pieces maybe haven't yet worked for us, but we see something in their work that we are interested in. But also, if we're getting work from somebody who, whose stories are just straight rejections every time, no problem, keep submitting to us. We are happy to keep reading your stories. Again, the exception being, as Fran mentioned, if your persistence is sort of more about trying to convince us that our guidelines should somehow be different from what they are, or you're trying to find ways to circumvent our guidelines, that is annoying. Because, magazines have established their guidelines for very good reasons. In our case, we have a particular demographic for a very good reason. You writing to us and saying that, well, I'm not an immigrant or a member of a diaspora, I don't see why I shouldn't be allowed to submit a story, is not going to convince us to change our mission, right? And these are sort of being vague, but these are all sort of, to some versions of things that have happened where people have a problem with the fact that we are specifically for immigrant and diaspora writers, or people have a problem with the fact that we have a word limit of 5,000 words. And they'll send something and say, actually, this story is longer, but I think you should still read it because, or they'll put in a fake, they'll put in the wrong word count. But then when we open the story, we realize it's actually significantly longer. So versions of that, that's just bad form, right? People are putting in a lot of work, a lot of unpaid work to read hundreds, thousands of stories that come in over the course of a year. And the least you can do is, respect the vision they have for their magazine, which, they've thought through very well. It's not just arbitrarily decided that this is our word limit or that this is the demographic that we're for. But yeah, other than that, even if every submission period I had a writer who was submitting something that I personally thought was terrible, I would still be rooting them on to keep submitting. So that, I think, is never, from my perspective, obnoxious.
Just to add a couple things responding to things that that Kanika said. We get a lot of people that ignore the guidelines, and I think all magazines get this. But for example, we have a firm upper limit of 10,000 words, and by that I mean 10,000 words, not 10,001. But we get people who say, "Yeah, it's 10,000 words," and then you open it up, it's an 80,000 word novel. I don't know what the point of that is, really. I'm not going to read that. I'm certainly not going to publish it. It's the wrong market. I don't know what you're doing. You're just wasting everybody's time. So there are people that just don't read the guidelines. The other thing, I'm always happy to have people keep submitting to us over and over. In the early days, we used a site called Submittable, and that sent emails from our email address, if you will. Now we use Moksha, which uses a black hole reply system. So if people reply to that, I don't ever see it. And that was intentional and one of the benefits of Moksha, frankly, because every now and then, not a lot, but every now and then you'd send out a rejection, and we used to give personal feedback to everybody. And somebody would write back and say, "You fucking asshole, you're a piece of shit magazine, this and that. Next time I submit," and I'm like, why would you submit again? Also, you're blocked, and that's much easier with Moksha. We don't get those emails anymore because maybe they send them, but I don't see them. So those people, no, I don't want them to apply to submit again. I don't want to see anything about them. The other thing that I would throw out that I think is interesting is that I did sort of a test 4 or 5 years back now. There were a couple of people that had submitted at least 20 times. And I thought, these people aren't quite making it, but I'd sure like to see their effort rewarded. So I wrote to two of them and said, "Hey, how about if we go through an editorial process, pick a story that you want to submit, and I'll work on it with you, and we'll see if we can get it." There's no guarantees, but we'll see if we can get it to a stage where I think it's publishable for us. And neither of those people took me up on it. So maybe it was too much work. Maybe it sounded intimidating. Maybe they just want to write the way they write, and that's fine. The other thing that some people take advantage of, but that is intentionally hidden away a little bit in our what's the rejectomancy portion of the site, is that people who have submitted, I think, 5 times to us and not had an acceptance can ask for overview feedback. And basically what happens is they pick 5 of the stories they've submitted that they want feedback on. I reread them. I go back and look at all my old notes. And then I say, okay, not per story, but here's what I'm seeing in these 5 stories overall. Here's where I think you're weak. Again, this is for my perspective as one editor, not overall, but here's what I'm seeing. I think your characters are strong, your ideas are strong, your prose is weak, or whatever it may be. This part is not working for us. Here's the story that was strongest. Here's the story that was weakest. Here's why. Would I have published? Well, I didn't publish any of those, but here's what would have made them better, what have you. And some people have liked that. Some people I've never heard from them again. So presumably they didn't like the feedback. It is intentionally hidden because it takes up a lot of time to do this. But I put that in because as a writer, I think, and if I really was interested in a market, that's the kind of feedback that I would want to get, is that specifically, not just per story, but what am I not doing that's right for you? So anyway, that people have taken advantage of.
I also just wanted to add that, luckily, the kinds of situations in which, although people often don't follow guidelines in some way, including sending us work that's not even speculative in any way, and we still might respond to that saying, "Hey, we're a speculative magazine. We didn't read this piece as speculative. Is there something we're missing, or some kind of cultural context or something that would, that we need to know to understand this as a speculative piece?" But in pretty much almost all of those cases, it's just that the writer didn't realize that we're a speculative magazine, right? So, I mean, do read at least one issue of the magazines that you submit to, you know. But you know, even though things of that sort happen, for me, actually, a larger concern is the people that we send encouraging rejections to and say, hey, please send us more work that we don't hear from again. And this happens. I know, at least in literary publishing, this is well documented. I haven't seen, you know, research on this in speculative fiction, but I imagine it happens in speculative publishing as well, which is that it's often women and people of color, and especially women of color who, you know, upon receiving rejections will be hesitant to send work again, or might think that there's, you know, oh, that's just a polite rejection, right? Or my work isn't ready yet. But you know, we have a lot of work to do, so we're not going to ask to see more work from you unless we really want to see more work from you. We're not just being polite. So I would say that if you're getting an encouraging rejection, you know, definitely send work again to that publication. And take it seriously when editors say to you, hey, I want to see more from you. Because no editor has time to just sort of offer that out of politeness, right? If they say it, they really do want to see more work from you.
You know, there is this rejectomancy thing, and sometimes you have to work it out per magazine. Charlie Finley at FNSF used to have, I think, 4 tiers or something, and you could look it up. If you got this phrase in your response email, it means this. If you got this phrase, it means this. I tried for a while. I haven't been as consistent about it in this past year, but I tried for a while to take the guesswork out of it. And I put in the subject line of the email, it's a rejection, but it's encouraging. Or I'd say, this is a form rejection, or this is a personal rejection, so that you know what it is. And the same, you know, if I say I want to see your work again, that means I want to see your work again. It's not politeness. If it says it's a form email, then it's a form email, and that's all you're going to get out of it. But Ismail had a question, but he's dropped off. So Bryce or Alicia, if you have other questions, go ahead. Bryce, it's your turn, if you will.
So just a quick question. So so one of the things that we obviously send you guys the story, and then the other component of it is often there's going to be some kind of a cover letter and such as well. And different magazines have different guidelines, and I kind of get the general sense that people don't do too much with the cover letter, but I guess quickly, what makes it good, what makes it bad, to what extent does the resume attached to the cover letter influence any of your decision, if at all? Just curious about that.
I'll take that first because my answer is very simple. And in fact, I had the developer at Moksha is very responsive, and I specifically had him make it possible to remove the cover letter field from our submission. So there is no way to attach a cover letter. Sometimes people try and sneak one in at the end of their story, at the start of their story, even though we say specifically don't do that. I couldn't care less, frankly. So I don't want to know anything about the author until such a point as I say, okay, I'm interested in your story. I want to work on revising it. That said, for when we did for a brief period have cover letters, and my own cover letter that I use as a writer is very simple. Dear editors, this is my story, title X, this many words. I look forward to hearing from you. That's all there is. Some magazines have specific requirements. So again, you need to read the guidelines for each one. But if they don't say anything, from my perspective, that's really all you need to provide. A way to contact you, the fact that you recognize something about the guidelines, you know, this is for your anthology, whatever it is, or this is for this magazine, and that's it. I don't I don't think you need to provide more than that. But again, people differ. So, Fran?
Yeah, we ask that there's a section where the writer can put in comments, and we ask only for their name, story title, word count, genre, and we specifically say, don't put in a resume. We don't want to judge your story. We want to judge your story, and whatever you've done aside from that has no bearing on it. It doesn't matter. Some people still put in resumes. A resume, then keep it professional sounding. Don't say, I live in sunny California and I have 5 cats. Just talk about the publications that you've been accepted to, that are maybe major ones. I was accepted to Asimov's for this story at this time. And the only other thing is, when you're submitting, I don't think you should ever offer a synopsis of your story. It's usually a big mistake. It's very hard to synopsize and have a story come out sounding good. It's like, the story's about that. No, I'm not even going to want to read it. So don't ever add that, I would say. And unless the magazine actually asks for that, but yeah. So all right, that's all.
Okay, Kanika?
Yeah. If there are guidelines, follow the guidelines. If you have a problem with the guidelines, don't submit to that publication. If there are no guidelines, keep it as simple as possible. That's what I would say. In our case, different editors may have different approaches towards, whether or not they read the cover letters before they read the story. I think in most cases, people will read the story first, and then if they are interested, or if they're wondering whether the writer might provide some additional context for the story, then they might look at the cover letter. In our case, we do encourage people to provide any brief cultural context or context about literary tradition that they think might be important, because we are limited in our knowledge, in our reading, and there may be cases in which it's helpful to know that, oh, I'm writing in this particular tradition, right? Or within this cultural context, there's a tradition of this kind of storytelling that I'm speaking back to here. It can be helpful to know those kinds of things, but that said, you don't want to veer into explaining your story. Or not, you don't, or as Fran said, offering a kind of synopsis or summary of it. So when in doubt, keep it as simple as possible. And to reiterate, don't submit to magazines if you have a problem with sort of their how they do business, or sort of, well, this is what we want to see, this is what we want the cover letter to look like. If you don't like it, there's lots of other publications. Submit to a magazine that you feel like this is in line with what I think a magazine should do, or should be like, or should interact with its writers, whatever it is.
Or start your own magazine, going back to Bryce's first question. It's not that hard. It's expensive, but it's not that hard. Alexia.
All right. I have a
I
sort
should
of
ask, am I
strange.
getting that? Is it Alicia or Alicia?
I don't care. Like, I
Okay.
just like people saying my name and feeling comfortable talking about me. I do pronounce it Alicia, but I went by Alicia in different circles of my family even, so we're good.
All right.
Um, okay, so this is sort of a strange question, but I'm going to be going to my first ReaderCon this year, or 2024. I have no con experience whatsoever. Honestly, I've been pretty isolated as a writer for the past many years, and I'm just starting to branch out into trying to be a part of the community, really. So my questions are like, do you go to cons? Are you present at cons? And if you are, is there a way that you like people to approach you? Like, do you like to just experience the con? Do you hate it when people say hi? Or is there like a nice way to say hi without being, you know, awkward or stepping over a line?
I'll take that because my answer is pretty quick. I don't go to that many cons. I'm very much an introvert, and I don't feel that comfortable going up and talking to other people. If other people come up and talk to me, great, terrific. If you've actually recognized me or know who I am, that's wonderful. I'm happy to talk about the magazine or writing or whatever for hours. So I don't think there's any problem with that. And I think as long as you're respectful and you're not interrupting somebody else's conversation or talk to me, talk to me, talk to me. If you come across somebody and go up and say hi and say, "Hello, I know you're the editor of such and such. Do you have time to talk?" I think people are going to respond to that well. So, Kanika?
Yeah, I don't, or I should say that the conferences that I have gone to have been largely literary, rather than speculative conferences. That has to do, in part with just that is in part just for professional reasons and reasons related to the fact that I'm a visa holder in this country and have to regularly renew my visa and show sort of like, my professional qualifications and what I've been doing throughout the year and all of that. And literary conferences work better for that purpose than cons and speculative publishing do. So that's just an individual reason, but also it's expensive. Also, I also am not, I tend to prefer conversation about writing and publishing in smaller communities rather than in very large venues. So yeah, I haven't had a lot of experience with them either. It's not my preferred environment for interacting with writers and publishers. But I think that also means that like probably the people you do run in or are more likely to run into cons are like happy to meet new people and want to be there and are happy to have you come up to them and say hi and be enthusiastic about their publication or ask questions about it or whatever. So, I guess people who show up a lot to these kinds of events are probably people who have the constitution for it and the desire for a lot of interaction.
Fran, your experience?
Yeah, I would like to go to cons, but I don't really have the time to do that. I mean, there are some great ones, and but it's a lot of time and travel involved. If I did go to them, I would be really happy to have writers come up and talk to me and ask me questions or make suggestions. Just not come up and immediately complain, you didn't accept my story, But any kind of friendly conversation would be great.
I would say from the writer's perspective, at the cons that I've been to, I mean, I've talked to some reasonably well-known editors and authors as a fan or as a writer, and people are very approachable. as long as you're polite and respectful, people like to be recognized, and they like to talk about the stuff they're doing. That's why they're there. They want to talk to other people who are doing similar things. And that's equally true of people who aren't famous and well known. They want to talk about this stuff. So again, a modicum of politeness will get you a long way. Bryce or Alicia, we don't need to alternate strictly. Whoever's first can go to it.
I do have one more.
Go to it.
Okay. So I've heard you guys all talk a lot about revision and how important it is. Obviously a very important thing, but it's also sort of a nebulous topic. We've talked about people revising in the wrong direction, for example. So are there any like revision passes that you would suggest that all writers make before submitting to you? Things like, obviously you want to make grammatical passes, but things like, do a dialogue pass or something like that. Do you have things that you wish that writers would do before submitting to you?
I wish that people knew how to use punctuation. Frankly, that's one of the things that I see a lot. I don't know. I don't want to sound like an old fogey. Nobody these days knows how to use punctuation. In my day, but it certainly seems like people don't know how to punctuate dialogue. And maybe that's always been true. I don't know. I can only say for the past 10 years, but know how that works. And it is different in different languages, the different kinds of quotation marks, whether you put the commas inside or outside, whatever. And there are arguments to be had about that, but have at least a basic understanding of how English punctuation works, because I see a lot of that missing. The obvious things, look for typos and so on. You should be doing that kind of thing anyway. Otherwise, I don't think I have a recommendation for your question in terms of how the editing works for stories that we accept. And everybody goes through several rounds of editing. It tends to be sort of a structural pass, like, this end is weak, or you're missing an interesting middle. And so it's very big structural elements. Move this around, or bulk this out, or cut this down. Then there's sort of a balance question. There's too much of this in the beginning and not enough of it in the end. And so you're kind of shifting things around. It's more a question of balancing rather than moving big structural things. And then there's lots of rounds of polishing, getting the language right, getting the characters right. But that's basically how it goes for us. I think that's harder to apply pre-submission because you don't know necessarily the things that I think are structural problems until I say so. You may see them on your own, but you may not agree. So it's hard to get those done beforehand. But those are the kind of the phases that I go through. Fran?
Yeah. I think sometimes when a writer gets a story finished, they may want to send it out right away. And I really recommend letting it sit for a while and going on to something else, and then coming back to it and looking at it again. Because if you've been going over and over it, it can actually get really hard to see some of the problems that are there. You just pass them over. If you come back with fresh eyes after a space of time, you're more likely to be able to see, whoa, I said that there, or why did I put that over here? And so you can edit your story again. I think much better that way. Let it go through several times of being edited by you, and look at it. And the other thing is, besides giving it time and going back to it, sometimes read the dialogue out loud, and then you realize that, wow, no one talks that way. It's not like, and so do you really think that this is the case? And you know that sometimes people don't talk that way, or that line's just put in there because you want to have the next thing be said, or a whole scene is just so that the next thing can happen. And those things should be taken out because they're not actually things you care about. You're just putting it in because it's set up for the thing you do care about. So look out for that too. Anything that you don't really enjoy reading, or you just go through to get to the next part, that's something that should probably be taken out, and the setup dealt with in a different way, in a way that makes it interesting. Yeah, even read the whole thing out loud, or read it as if you were a critic, or as if you had to take out a bunch of words. One thing we find is that almost all the stories are overwritten, and a 7,000 word story could much better be 4,000 words. So you may be killing your story with just a bunch of words that shouldn't be there. So those are some of the things I would say look at ahead of time before ever sending.
Diane Walton has joined us. Thank you, Diane. I'll give you a chance in just a minute. A question from Alicia is, what kind of editorial passes writers should go through before submitting, things in particular that they should look at? So Kanika, do you want to take a stab at that?
I would absolutely agree with Fran's advice to put the work away for a while, give yourself an opportunity to see it with fresher eyes before you submit it. I know that can be really hard to do because you have a lot of excitement about this work that you've written and think is ready and want to send it off right away. But I do think both in terms of being able to see your work anew, and also if you give it some time, if you receive some feedback, say you submit the work and maybe it's not accepted, or even if it is, there's feedback from the editors. It also means that you'll be able to receive that feedback, I think, with more perspective, because you do have some distance from the work. I would say that one thing with that I've noticed with speculative work in particular, and that we talk about a lot in our decision-making process, is how important are the speculative elements of the story to the story, right? Would this story be essentially the same without those elements? We get a lot of story that have speculative elements in them, but those speculative elements are not integral to the story, or are not making the story speculative in a way that feels exciting or challenging to us. Sure, there are ghosts in your story, but so what, right? Like, what are they doing for the story? Why are they needed in this story? Thinking about what makes your work speculative and what is the importance of the speculative elements in the piece. And another thing is that we also see quite a lot of submissions where there's a really interesting idea or concept, but it's not a story. And there's a difference between an idea and a story. And so I think that's always, and again, I don't mean necessarily, because for us, we're not necessarily looking for stories that are plot driven, not even necessarily stories that have a plot at all. So it's not about when I say story, I'm not referring to plot specifically, right? I just mean, is it just something that I read and go, oh, cool idea, right? But in other ways, it's not compelling as a work of fiction. Again, I think that's the kind of thing that can become apparent to writers if they put the work away for a while and come back to it. I think it's again, when you're excited about an idea, if you bang out a story, I mean, I say bang out a story, that's something I never do as a writer. So I don't really know how that happens when people go from idea to story, like, in a day or a week. It's a process I'm completely unfamiliar with, but I guess it does happen for some people. And I think you're, because you're so excited about it, you're far less likely to be able to see that, okay, yes, this is a great idea, but this isn't a story yet, because it's sort of like the idea does seem like the story to you. So those would be my two pieces of advice. Think about the importance of the speculative elements, and think about whether this great, I mean, if you're somebody who sort of begins with, a great idea as the place from where they begin writing a story. Not everybody begins writing that way, but if you are, then give yourself some time to think about, has this idea actually developed into a story?
Okay. Diane, again, thanks for joining us. If you want to do just a quick introduction first.
I've been managing editor of OnSpec magazine, which is a Canadian magazine, short fiction, and for around 33 years now, I think. I started as a fiction editor, but then I took over the managing editorship about 20 years ago. And we're right in the middle of our slush reading period right now. So if anybody has got any stories to send out, we're open until the 15th of December. So that's good. I think what I just heard said is basically the same issue that we've got too. Like, if somebody sends us a story with no speculative elements, or they're just kind of painted on, we can tell. Like, we can sort of, strip it away and say, okay, would this story have existed in contemporary times with no SF at all? And if we say that, then it's definitely not going to be accepted by us. And one of my editors has an acronym, an HAITE, which is, here's an idea, the end. And we get a lot of those stories, and the other kind of story, I think, with us is without a clear resolution. So if you get to the end of a story and go, and then what happened, then it's not done.
Okay. We have time for maybe just a couple more questions, if you guys have them. If not, that's fine too.
I always do, but Bryce, do you have more questions?
No, go ahead. I guess one thing I'll just toss in here is more of a comment. And I know a lot of people who read, and they're not necessarily great fans of audiobooks. And I had been that way for most of my life. I think I had been scarred by a couple of bad experiences, maybe in kind of the 2000s, where the narration wasn't so good and the narrator can kind of make or break it. Anyway, so a bit over a year ago, we had our first shot. I'll say the amount of time that I've spent listening to audio over reading, and that time has gone way up. And especially for short fiction, now that I've found all these podcasts, I've had to kind of acclimatize myself to it, but it's become quite handy just because of the accessibility, because it's hands off. I can be tidying up or chasing someone around and have an earbud in and stuff like that. For the busy world that we live in, it actually fits in quite well, and it's flipped around to the point where I probably now spend more time listening to audio, in my car if I'm going to work or around whatever I'm doing, than with my hands on a book. And it's a different experience, but it does add a lot of value. And so that's not a question, but it's something that surprised me, because I went well over a decade being like, well, I don't like this. And I'm sure that's not for everyone, but there's just some utility there that's is very nice.
Interesting point. I hadn't thought about that that portion of the audiobook audience as people with kids, particularly, who are busy running around after folks. Alicia.
Hey, I don't know about what the rules are for asking questions. Is it okay to ask a question to one
Yeah,
editor?
absolutely.
Okay. Okay, so I have a question for Kanika, and I don't want to put you on the spot. So you can say, I don't want to answer this. It's not about
I
a
would just
submission.
throw in, okay. That's
Okay.
it. Don't ask about a particular
I've never
submission.
submitted to Kanika. It's a prospective submission question. So I know that that khōréō is about immigration and diaspora, and so my question is where the lines are on that. So I have a lot of my identity is on the fringes of a lot of things. I specifically, my grandfather was immigrated here from Taiwan. He's part of an indigenous culture there, but I never knew him. My parent was adopted. We're completely separated. So a lot of my stories have to do with adoption and being disconnected from cultures of ancestry. And so I feel strange submitting to khōréō, for example, because I don't know, like, is this for me? I look very white. I come from a very white culture. I'm not marginalized. And I know you're not going to speak for all magazines, but this is like a question that I have sometimes when approaching magazines. Like, I don't want to waste people's time. I don't want to be like, take my story over someone else's. I don't want to steal someone's spotlight. What kind of advice do you have for people who are maybe not sure if they fit in, or you know, or who are maybe on the edge of things?
Mm-hmm. So let me say something about how khōréō specifically approaches this, and then sort of what I see more broadly in publishing. So we say that if you're not sure, you know, go ahead and send us your work. Don't sort of don't self-reject in advance. What I would add to that is, so we can't and don't want to decide for our readers and writers what it means to be an immigrant or a member of a diaspora, right? So I would say instead it's worth thinking about it as, have those things been important aspects of my identity and experience, right? Do I think about immigration, diaspora, etc., or have I been thinking about those things, especially in my writing, even before I encountered khōréō and then started thinking, right, like, do I am I eligible to send work? I mean, occasionally, you know, we've gotten submissions which are like, I am not an immigrant or a member of the diaspora, but my wife is. And, you know, if you, and that's where we would say, well, if it hasn't been an important part of your own identity and experience, you know, then sort of proximity to somebody for whom it has been an important part is not really what, you know, what brings you into the community, we would say. But again, I think it's for writers and readers to think about those things. The other thing I would say is, and I'm a little bit hesitant to say this because this is one of those kinds of things where it's sort of the most the people who are most thoughtful and most conscientious about this, who we would like to hear from, may decide that, oh no, I shouldn't submit after all. So I'm a little hesitant about whether to say this or how to say this, but you know, I think it's always worth thinking when you're submitting to publications that are for a particular marginalized demographic. And two of the publications I edit for are in that boat. khōréō with immigrant and diaspora populations, and Faglitter for queer and trans readers and writers. I think it's always worth thinking about what opportunities do I have as a writer, right? What opportunities have I had as a writer? Given the person that I am, given the kind of work that I do, are there many publications, venues, etc., that my work is a good fit for, right? Do I feel like my work is whether we want to say, you know, in the mainstream in some way because it's part of the dominant culture, or because you come, you know, from literary traditions that are widely known in the culture or in the publishing landscape you inhabit. I think it's worth thinking about what opportunities you have had and do have given who you are and the kind of work you publish. And so therefore, you know, what spaces do you want to occupy and not occupy, right? And like occupation in that sense can be sort of thinking about, have I seen myself as a part of this community? Have I already been engaged with this community? Or am I just sort of seeing this as an opportunity? Oh, here's one more venue I can send my work to, right? I haven't thought about myself as an immigrant or a member of the diaspora. I haven't, or engaged with those communities. I haven't, I don't really know if I'm queer or trans, or that's not really something I've been thinking about, but I'm questioning some things. So I think it's okay for me to send my work here. I really do think about my work in these, you know, with these magazines as an editor, as a reader, as a writer, as being about building communities and creating opportunities for people who might not otherwise have them. And I try to think about that when I'm submitting my work as well. You know, is this a community I have been a part of or want to be a part of? Or am I purely just seeing this as one more place that I could potentially publish my work? Is that helpful, Alicia?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we have time for maybe one more question and then some final comments or statements from the panelists. Alicia, if you or Bryce have a final question, if not, that's fine too.
I know there's been some discussion in the past about people have talked about kind of writing feedback groups and say finding they've found open forums or groups anywhere else. Does there happen to exist anything of that sort for speculative fiction? I think in the past people have said, well, it's kind of been like, you know, all genres, all writers, it ends up being a bunch of a muddle. Does anybody know, is there kind of a group like that exists, or has that been discussed in the past?
There are certainly critters.org is one that's free. It's basically an exchange model that works reasonably well. You can work at your own pace. I used to belong to the Online Writers Workshop, and either it was speculative oriented or they had a speculative section of it. I thought that was pretty useful. And there's another one that for people who have been published that I can't remember the name of right now. So there are groups that are particularly focused on speculative writing. I don't know, Fran, Diane, Kanika, you have other suggestions?
I was going to say critters also. They're they're really good. They've been around for a long time. They have a lot on what you do is you critique other people's stories, and then you get a turn getting yours critiqued. And the thing is that both sides of these things really help you become a better writer. And they even give you guidelines on how, how to critique in a way that that writers can accept rather than get angry at. So yeah, I would definitely recommend Critters.
I have
Diane or
something
Kanika?
to add if we want.
Sure, go ahead.
I'm not one of the editors, but I have spent years trying to find a good group and have finally found one, and I can give a little bit of feedback on that. I got very overwhelmed by Critters, and so that just wasn't right for me. And I joined a regular mainstream literary group, and that didn't work for me. And I joined Mastodon and wrote very, very sad posts about like, does anyone want to write with me? So, and nobody did. So what I eventually did is I joined an organization called the Speculative Literature Foundation. It's called SLF. They have a co-writing group that's actually happening at this time exactly. So if you're available at this time, we all get together and we write. And after about a year of doing that, I said, does anyone want to be in a writing group with me? And we're in a group of 7 people now. So we might not have room for you exactly at this moment. We might in the future, but if you can make your own group, like I really recommend it. If you see people doing what you're doing and trying to do the same thing, who are going to understand the struggle that you're in, who are going to see, like we have people at different levels, people who are just coming out of school and people who've been published in several professional rate markets. So that's what I'd recommend. Just be vulnerable, ask a lot of people, be willing to be rejected a lot, which as a writer, you're already pretty used to, hopefully, or will be used to soon. And I recommend the SLF a lot.
Just make a comment on that if you find the right small group, that's wonderful. Writers groups and egos and conflicts can also happen very easily, and you can end up getting sick of a group. That's, I guess, one benefit of something large like Critters, that that kind of thing can't happen as easily, although it doesn't have then the close connection that you can get from a small group, as that Alicia is talking about. So just be aware of that if you're looking for a smaller writing circle.
The other thing that
smaller groups,
Right.
you have to sort of leave your ego at the door, and that should be one of the ground rules right off the bat.
Yeah.
I was going to say that's one of the things you need to learn about any critical or review group is what style you want and what style works for you. So, for example, I found that when I was part of the online writers workshop, what's most useful for me is people who are blunt and negative and critical. One of the most useful comments I got from a guy who was well published is, this story just sucks and here's why. And that's great for me. Other people are more sensitive and don't want to hear that. They want to hear, this was really good about your story, and this maybe could have been, and that's fine. Any part of that is fine, but you need to learn what works for you. I do recommend that for whatever style it is, you recognize that people aren't criticizing you; they're criticizing your story. And there's the real difference there, and you shouldn't take whatever they say, even if they say this sucks and it's the worst thing I've ever seen. Don't take it personally. That's that person's opinion. If they say something valuable, great. If they don't say anything valuable, just ignore it. So, kind of key rule for criticism in general, I think. Okay, let's leave it at that. At least on my side, my dog is telling me that it's well past her time to go for her walk, and she's becoming more and more vocal about that. So you may hear some of this in the background as we close up. Final comments from panelists. I'll just make my own that we're making some changes for next year. We're going to do next year a little bit differently. For the past 8 years, we've published a story every Friday, and they've all but one been unsolicited from the slush pile. Next year, we're coming up on issues 97, 98, 99, and 100 of the magazine. And so we're doing only solicited stories and art from some of my favorite authors, and they'll be coming out once a month. So that's a difference for us. That'll be starting on the first Friday of January. Fran, any announcements or comments from you?
I guess just that we have, beside the magazine, and I hope we do more stories for next year and maybe some podcasts. We do have the benefit anthology that came out, which was To Ukraine with Love, where all the stories were and artwork were donated, and all the profits will go to Ukraine. And the illustrated version is out already, but it's illustrated in black and white. Next year is going to come out with color illustration for every story, and it'll be in print and in EPUB. And we're going to do an audiobook version of that too, which will have, some of the stories will be narrated by the authors. So yeah, that's going to come out for next year. And I hope we do more with the Kepler Award, which is our, it's a section for, we're looking for stories with very, I guess, hard science fiction based on real science and speculating off of that. And for this year, we had some great judges. And actually, Jeffrey Landis is one of the judges for this year. And I hope he will be for next year. And then the others are Andrew Bird from Critters and Professor Virginia Trimble, if anybody knows astrophysicists, she's way up there. And also Douglas Duzin, who is a geneticist. So we hope to do a lot more and maybe publicize that a lot more for next year so we get more submissions. That's us.
Okay. Kanika.
khōréō will be opening for submissions again in January. We usually have, or our plan originally was to have, 4 submission periods a year, but as we have become better known and have been receiving more submissions, sometimes it happens that one submission period will give us enough good work to fill multiple issues, and so then we won't have our next submission period. So we maybe it's more like going forward, maybe we'll only have 2, maybe 3 submission periods a year, but we will be open again in January for a month. And we are also, next year, we're also going to be working more on getting on publishing translations. So we are putting more energy into that. And also, when we had started, we were also publishing nonfiction. We stopped that for a while for a variety of reasons. We're hoping to get that going again as well, sometime within the next year.
Okay. Diane.
Yeah, as I mentioned, we're open until the 15th of December. And last year, in our 1 submission period, we ended up getting enough stories to fill 6 issues. So we're only having 1 submission period a year these days. Read the guidelines. Everything is clear on our website, onspec.ca. And, send what you've got. We do have a maximum number of words. Our mandate is 80% Canadian editorial content, which means that we can fill in with people, stories from other countries, which we have done quite a bit of over the years. So if you hear any nasty rumors that says we only buy Canadian, don't believe it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all to all of you for coming today, and I'll publish the video later today or by tomorrow. And thanks very much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks for hosting this, Morris.
Sure.
Thank you.
Bye.